Good afternoon. I think we actually need to get the keynote panelists up here, so why don't we have them come up? If everyone comes up, and the commentators as well, I think we all come up on to the podium now. Yeah, commentators as well. I think that way we don't. I want to, on behalf of Wilmer, first of all, thank the organizers, Petra, and the other organizers. I want to thank all of you for coming. I think we're all looking forward to what will be, I think, a fantastic day and a half. We're lucky to be able to host this group. We're lucky in particular to have people from all aspects of the issues we're going to be talking about. We have people who are in the most critical positions in various countries dealing with these issues. We have leading academics who are focusing on these issues, and we have I think the benefit of the perspective of private practitioners as well over the course of the next day and a half. So I think we have a fantastic platform to talk about these issues, and I want to thank everyone for attending. Let me briefly explain how we're hoping to proceed. Do we have enough chairs? Or we blocked people off? We have 3 keynote speakers. And so we will have the 3 keynote speakers start by making brief remarks, presentations, and then we have 4 commentators who will speak to the presentations. And the idea is to have an overview of the issues that we're going to spend the next day and a half talking about. We'll take about half an hour, 40 minutes for the initial presentations, and then we'll have a while for the commentators to talk. And then we want to make sure that we hear from the audience. This is meant to be something where we have a discussion, and so we're keeping a good chunk of time available for everyone to participate, ask questions, and continue the dialogue that will begin with the commentators. So let me, with that in mind, let me introduce our first presenter and our first keynote speaker. And as I said, we'll have 3 keynote speakers and then the commentators. So our first keynote speaker is Dr. Edwini Kessie. Like almost everybody, I think, who's here, he has a very multinational background. Like many people here, he's qualified as a lawyer in lots of jurisdictions. I will let you read everyone's bios, but let me highlight to you why we have him speaking. He's on leave from the World Trade Organization, where he's worked for nearly 20 years in a variety of roles. He is now the chief trade advisor for the Forum Island countries, and he's been doing that for the last 4 years. In that capacity, he gives technical advice on a broad range of issues, the issues that we're talking about for the next day and a half, including supporting the FIC in their PACER Plus negotiations with Australia and New Zealand. He will, I think, now give us a presentation. I'll get out of the way to get us kicked off, and then we'll move on to the next keynote speakers after that. Thank you. Do you want to?
Thank you, Petra, and the organizers for inviting me. I came all the way from Vanuatu, so you can imagine it took me nearly 2 days to get here, but it's good to be here and also, to share my perspectives on this important issue. Obviously, I think, as Petra pointed out, small states populations range from 1,500 to 1.5 million. And some of the countries I work for representing the PACER Plus negotiations, I have Niue, which has a population of 1,400, very small. And then we have countries like Nauru, 10,000 people. So a lot of the Pacific Island countries would have a population of less than 20,000 in many cases, a lot of the island states. So you see that they have a lot of challenges. And as we saw from the map, most of these countries are in the Pacific and the Caribbean. They are prone to natural disasters. I have been living in Vanuatu for the last 4 years, and last year we had Cyclone Pam, which devastated the island, and actually it will take them some time to recover from the damage which was done last year. And one of the key issues also is that they are far removed from key markets, particularly in the case of the Pacific, which adds to trade costs are higher, and that also acts as a deterrent to investment because, the cost of shipping is incredibly very expensive, and obviously that affects the competitiveness of Pacific firms. The Caribbean is a little bit better in the sense that they are closer to Latin America and the United States. So the challenges that they face are quite different from that of the Pacific. Lack of economies of scale. In the case of the Pacific, for example, if you include Papua New Guinea, which has a population of 7.5 million, the whole Pacific is 10 million. So if you get out Papua New Guinea, it's only 2.5 million out of the 14 foreign island countries that are negotiating the PESA Plus agreement. Generally, most of the small island states, because they are so small and they do not have natural resources, they are quite open to trade and investment as compared to other WTO members, developing country members. Most of the countries see economic integration as key to overcoming some of their inherent disadvantages. So most of the small island states, if you go to the Caribbean, we have CARICOM, the OECS. In the Pacific, there is PICTA, there's MSG trade agreement, and there is also the Micronesians. They are recently signed an agreement called MTEC, which I'll talk about later on. Now, in the case of the small island states, I think one of the key drivers of regional integration is that they believe that through regional integration, they would be able to overcome some of their unique challenges. And for example, in the PESA Plus negotiations I'm involved in, once we conclude, that will be a market of 40 million, because Australia is about 25 million, New Zealand roughly about 4.5. So that would then actually create new opportunities for Pacific firms, because if they are producing for especially Australia and New Zealand being developed countries and very rich countries, this will provide opportunities for these small island states. Also, by coming together, regional integration, they are able to enhance their negotiating power. If you look, for example, in the WTO, for example, we have the Small Economies Work Program, although that fell far short of what the countries wanted. But generally, I think the WTO members now realize that, unlike LDCs, because in the WTO, the membership is against the creation of subcategories. But I think there is the acceptance that the small island states face unique challenges and that more has to be done to address their concerns at the WTO. Now, if we look at the Caribbean, I just use the Caribbean and the Pacific. So the Caribbean, we have CARICOM, OECS, CARIFORUM, EU, EPA, and the negotiations with Canada, which were suspended. But I hope that, I think, with the new government in Canada, I think they may revive those negotiations. In the case of the Pacific, we see a proliferation of regional trade agreements. There is PICTA. So PICTA is for all the 14 Pacific Island countries. And then there is the MSG trade agreement. These are among the 4 Melanesian countries. And then the NFNLKS of New Caledonia. And then there is the MTEC, which is for the Northern Pacific countries, Palau, Marshall Islands, and then Palau, we have Palau, Marshall Islands, and then, which is the third one?
Guam.
Not Guam. So this was only the 3 countries, but hopefully they would like to extend it. So FSM, Federated State of Micronesia, RMI, but obviously I think my own advice to them is that I think there has to be consolidation because they are too small, and if you have so many agreements with overlapping rules, it is not good for the region. So I always advise them that, look, they need to consolidate the regional trade agreements, but it is something which the countries have. Now, the negotiations I've been involved in is the PESA Plus agreement, and we are quite close to concluding the negotiations, but as usual with trade negotiations, there are always hiccups along the way, but we are aiming at finishing the negotiations by August. So that is the plan, but you never know. But now, if you look at regional integration among the small states, they have not achieved the potential. And this is mainly because the countries are too small. So even if you look at the OECS, which is really much more integrated than, let's say, the MSG, you find that the gains from integration remain limited. And this is because of the size of the countries involved. Intra-trade, the same with the Pacific, intra-trade is very low. Only half of the fix, for example, the PICTA was concluded in the early 2000s, but you find that half of the countries are not trading under PICTA. The MSG trade agreement is much more successful, but you find that even in the context of that, there was actually a news item today. The Minister of Papua New Guinea was complaining that Fiji is the country which dominates trade among the MSG, and the numbers are not huge. You know, Fiji exports something like $47 million worth of goods to Papua New Guinea, and Papua New Guinea around 17 million. And these are the two biggest among the MSG countries. So we see that the level of trade is actually quite small. Now, one other thing is that in the context of, I think generally it is accepted that if the small island states are to benefit from trade and investment, it will be better if they negotiate or have agreements with the larger trading nations. For example, the IMF did a study, and the results of the study indicated that when Australia and New Zealand, in times of economic boom, they do have a very positive impact on the Pacific Island countries. So you find like a country like Papua New Guinea, it trades more with Australia than it trades with all the Pacific Island countries combined. So it is very key, and the same with the Caribbean countries as well. If you look at the United States dominates trade with the Caribbean countries, the United States, European Union, Canada, than the SME countries collectively. So you find that trade with the big countries, there is the potential, but to date, the gains have been limited. And that I'll come back and address that some of the reasons why you find that the small island states find it difficult to benefit from trade agreements with larger trading partners. And these are issues which I think need to be addressed. And I think certainly for small island states to benefit from regional integration, they need to deepen integration amongst themselves. The Caribbean is a little bit ahead than the Pacific. However, I think it is also very important for the trade agreements to be accompanied by significant aid for trade, because trade liberalization on its own will not actually enhance the trading opportunities, or the countries will not be able to enhance their performance in the trading system just because they conclude an agreement with a developed country. So this is something that we are doing in PESA Plus, and Australia and New Zealand have accepted that at the end of the day, they accept that the agreement itself will not per se bring economic benefits, and that it has to be accompanied by a substantial aid for trade package, not only to help the countries to implement the agreement, but to address the supply side constraints which have prevented the countries in the past from taking advantage of preferential market access under these agreements. So I think that is the point, that there should be more aid for trade and not recycling. There has to be, and at least in the PESA Plus context, this is what the Pacific Island countries have been pressing Australia and New Zealand, that they need to commit new resources, so as to enhance their productive capacity and also to reduce the supply side constraints, the ports and others. So this is something that we are working on. And in the case, it's also important for the private sector in small island states to be supported. They have unique challenges, unique problems. So having a high-level trade agreement without support to the private sector in the small island states, I think it would be fruitless, or the benefits would not be as great as one would like it to be. And also the developed countries need to also promote the small island states to their potential or to their investors. And this is something that in PESA Plus we are pushing Australia and New Zealand to try to provide incentives to their investors so they can invest in the small island states. Now, turning on to dispute settlement, if you look at most of the agreements, either among the small island states or with other trading partners, if you look at CARICOM, they have the Court of Justice, the PICTA and MSGSTA, they have an ad hoc panel system based on the WTO, EU CARIFORUM, and PESA Plus. also based on the WTO dispute settlement mechanism. In the context of the Pacific, when we started to discuss dispute settlement, two issues really came to the fore, and one was whether we needed to have two separate mechanisms, one for dealing with trade disputes and one for dealing with investment disputes. So we spent a lot of time thinking about that. So for trade, it was quickly agreed among the parties that the WTO system is well tested, so there was agreement on that. Now, in terms of investment disputes, this is where the parties basically, New Zealand's initial position was that it wanted to have investor state, it wanted to have international arbitration when there are disputes, and mainly because I think from New Zealand's perspective, it wasn't so much the small island states, but with Australia. So that is what made New Zealand to demand. But the Pacific Island states and Australia were united against New Zealand, so New Zealand backed down. Because the small island states basically said, we don't have any arbitration experience, apart from Papua New Guinea, which has more natural resources, and it has been a party to a number of arbitration cases. Most of the Pacific Island countries are not active. Apart from Papua New Guinea, Tonga, and Vanuatu, out of the 14 islands, most of them even don't have a BIT. And even the one between Tonga and Vanuatu, I think about 2 or 3 agreements. So apart from Papua New Guinea, which is a different game, population of 7.5 million, very rich in natural resources, LNG, gold, diamonds. So Papua New Guinea has a lot of experience, and it has a number of cases. In fact, Gary participated. Gary is not here with us, but last year Gary made mention that he was one of the arbitrators in a case which actually, I think Papua New Guinea won against Singapore. So in our case, it has been some of the things that we took into account was that given that the Pacific Island countries do not attract a lot of investment, if the agreement does not have a credible dispute settlement mechanism, there was the fear among the Pacific Island countries that it would affect investment flows. So that was one of the things that there was the need for certainty. The issue of domestic courts to settle these investment disputes, we discussed that at length. A number of the countries, the challenge we have is that in a number of the Pacific Island countries, they do not have domestic courts which are very conversant with international arbitration rules. So if you say that investment disputes should be settled by domestic courts, I think apart from Australia or New Zealand, and to maybe a lesser extent Papua New Guinea, most of the countries don't have courts which can actually deal with complex investment cases. So that was one of the things, the cost implications for the small island states as well was, the countries raised it. Australia and New Zealand appreciated the fact that, well, look, it is true. Some of the countries like, Niue, 1,500 people, lack of legal expertise, if they were to have a case initiated against them, it kind of break the budget of the country. So these were the sort of things that we took into account, and it has made it quite difficult. We agreed that, there should be dispute avoidance measures, use of good offices of the head of the promotion authority at the national level, and at the regional level, they could use the good offices of the Director General of the Forum Island Secretariat. But in the end, still the issues are still pending. We have agreed tentatively that investment disputes between host countries and investors will have to be settled in domestic courts. But as I said, there's a question mark. Most of the countries do not have courts which can really arbitrate such issues. So, and for example, most of the investment will come from Australia and New Zealand. Now, would Australian and New Zealand investors be content going to domestic courts, let's say of Nauru, where, even they rely for simple civil cases, they rely on judges from Australia and New Zealand. So these are the sort of issues that we are grappling with, that we need to have certainty. At the same time, too, we also have to take into account the unique circumstances of the small island states. So in the case of the Pacific, as I said, it's very difficult. We have agreed to return to this issue, but these are the sort of considerations we had proposed. The Pacific Island countries had proposed a non-binding mediation mechanism, which we actually base it on the CETA between Canada and the European Union. But Australia and New Zealand were not very keen on non-binding mediation. So this is something that we need to see how we can take it forward. Clearly, I think for Australia and New Zealand, they feel that I think they would like, eventually, they would like to have international arbitration, but they want to have a gap whereby the country's capacity will be built, but they think that it may be too soon if they were to impose, let's say, that there should be international arbitration under ICSID or UNCITRAL. So it is a question of time, and that is what Australia and New Zealand, basically, they think that with time, then we can revisit. But at the same time, as I said, they are not very keen on non-binding mediation like what is in the Canada-EU one. So it's something that I think we need to reflect further on. So I think I'll just stop here. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Dr. Kessie, for getting us started.